It was a humid evening on June 19, 1953, when Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were led, one after the other, into the execution chamber at Sing Sing Prison in New York. Julius Rosenberg entered first, wearing a prison-issued khaki shirt and a look of defiance. His wife Ethel followed just minutes later. She was the first woman in American history to be executed for a political crime, and the first civilian woman to lose her life by federal order since Mary Surratt in 1865. They had been convicted of conspiracy to commit espionage, accused of giving atomic bomb secrets to the Soviet Union at the height of the Cold War. The charge alone was explosive, but what followed, the trial, the sentence, the public outcry, turned their case into one of the most controversial in American history. Julius's life ended swiftly. Ethel's did not. Witnesses later said it took 3 electric shocks before her heart stopped. She remained conscious between jolts, her body visibly lifted from the chair. Outside the prison, hundreds protested. Inside, the 2 sons they left behind, Michael and Robert, became orphans. To some, the Rosenbergs were traitors. To others, they were symbols of injustice, victims of Cold War paranoia, sacrificed for political theater. But one thing is clear, their story didn't end that night. In fact, the questions surrounding their guilt, the strength of the evidence, and the government's motives have only grown more complicated over time. Before the headlines and the courtroom, they were just 2 young idealists in New York. Julius Rosenberg, the son of Polish-Jewish immigrants, was a bright, ambitious electrical engineering student at the City College of New York. Ethel Greenglass, a spirited woman from a working-class Jewish family in the Bronx, was a talented singer with a strong voice, both on stage and in politics. They met through leftist activism in the late 1930s, during the tail end of the Great Depression. Times were hard, banks had failed, jobs were scarce, and to many young Americans, especially in urban working-class communities, capitalism felt broken. Communism offered something different, a promise of economic justice, solidarity, and resistance against fascism. It wasn't unusual for young intellectuals to join the Communist Party. For Julius and Ethel, it became both a political home and the foundation of their relationship. They married in 1939 and began building a modest life together. Julius found work as a civilian engineer with the U.S. Army Signal Corps. Ethel raised their 2 sons while continuing her union activism. On the surface, they were an ordinary American couple, but beneath that, their political convictions never faded. As the Second World War ended and the Cold War began, those convictions would draw the attention of the FBI and ultimately seal their fate. The chain of events that would eventually lead to Julius and Ethel Rosenberg's execution began not with them, but with someone much closer to home. Ethel's younger brother, David Greenglass, a high school dropout with mechanical skills. Greenglass was drafted into the U.S. Army during World War II and eventually assigned to the Manhattan Project, the top-secret program building the world's first atomic bomb. Stationed at Los Alamos, New Mexico, Greenglass worked as a machinist, not a scientist, but still close enough to pick up valuable details. In 1944, according to later testimony, Julius Rosenberg approached his brother-in-law and asked him to share classified information. Julius, who had been recruited by Soviet intelligence as early as 1942, allegedly passed this information to the KGB through a network of couriers. The goal was to help America's wartime ally, the Soviet Union, develop its own nuclear program. Greenglass later claimed that he gave Julius crude sketches and notes about the bomb's design, including details on the explosive lens system used to detonate the plutonium core. Julius, in turn, reportedly passed them to Soviet contacts, but historians now debate how crucial or even accurate this information really was. Some argue the Soviets already had better sources inside the project, like British physicist Klaus Fuchs. Greenglass's notes may have been redundant, if not irrelevant. Still, to the U.S. government, any leak from Los Alamos was a major breach, and Julius's role as a middleman, even if not the mastermind, marked him as a serious threat. What made it worse was that the espionage ring wasn't made up of foreign agents hiding in shadows. It was built around family, trust, and shared ideology, right in the heart of New York. By 1950, the walls were closing in, after British scientist Klaus Fuchs was caught supplying nuclear information to the Soviets. American investigators began tracing connections back to others involved in the espionage web. That trail eventually led to David Greenglass. Arrested and interrogated, Greenglass faced a stark choice: cooperate. Under mounting pressure, he agreed to a deal. In exchange for a lighter sentence, sentence and protection for his wife Ruth, he provided sworn testimony against his own family. He named Julius Rosenberg as the person who had recruited him to pass atomic secrets. And then, most damningly, he accused his sister, Ethel Rosenberg, of actively participating. According to his statement, Ethel had typed up the notes he delivered to Julius for transmission to Soviet agents. This testimony became the cornerstone of the government's case. There were no photographs, no intercepted messages, no physical evidence tying Ethel to espionage. Just her brother's word, a word he later admitted had been tailored to protect his wife, not to tell the full truth. In a 1996 interview, Greenglass confessed that he had lied about Ethel's role. "I would not sacrifice my wife and my children for my sister," he said. "I wrote it out the way they wanted it." The implications were staggering. Ethel Rosenberg's life was ultimately taken based on an accusation that was later recanted. She wasn't arrested when Julius was. She was brought in later when the FBI realized Julius wasn't cooperating. Internal documents show that officials believed threatening Ethel's life might pressure her husband to confess. It didn't. They both stayed silent and paid the ultimate price for it. When the Rosenberg trial began in March 1951, it wasn't just a legal proceeding. It was a national event. The courtroom was packed, the media was relentless, and the air outside crackled with fear and fury. The Cold War had turned hot in Korea. Senator Joseph McCarthy was fueling anti-communist hysteria, and Americans were desperate for someone to blame. The government's narrative was simple and chilling. Julius Rosenberg had operated a Soviet spy ring, feeding atomic secrets to Moscow, and his wife Ethel had knowingly helped him. Prosecutors leaned heavily on the testimony of David Greenglass and his wife Ruth, both of whom had struck deals for lighter sentences. Ruth claimed to have witnessed Ethel typing up classified notes, a claim that would later be questioned, but at the time, it shocked the courtroom. Julius and Ethel pleaded not guilty. They refused to testify or name any names, citing their Fifth Amendment rights. To their supporters, that silence was a sign of principle. To much of the public, it looked like proof of guilt. The atmosphere outside the courtroom made neutrality nearly impossible. The Rosenbergs weren't just defendants, they were seen as symbols of betrayal in the nuclear age. The judge, Irving Kaufman, did little to hide his outrage. During sentencing, he claimed the Rosenbergs' actions had led to the communist aggression in Korea and could have sparked a future world war. It was a stunning accusation, linking their case not just to espionage, but to the global bloodshed unfolding in real time. The trial ended with both being sentenced to death. And just like that, a courtroom drama became a political warning. The government's case against Julius Rosenberg was strong enough to convince a jury, but not without controversy. Years later, declassified Soviet documents and the U.S. Venona project would confirm that Julius had indeed shared information with Soviet intelligence. He operated under the codename Liberal and maintained contact with known Soviet agents during the 1940s. But what exactly he gave them, and how critical it was, remains debated. Some experts argue that the Soviets already had more advanced sources inside the Manhattan Project, and that Julius's contributions, while illegal, didn't drastically change the balance of power. Ethel's case, however, was even more troubling. She wasn't named in Venona decryptions. She wasn't seen handing over documents or meeting with Soviet contacts. In fact, her only alleged crime came from the testimony of her brother. Inside the FBI, officials knew the case against Ethel was thin. Memos revealed that her arrest and prosecution were strategic, intended to pressure Julius into confessing and naming names. When he refused, the government doubled down. They pursued the maximum sentence for both. It was a calculated move during a time of deep fear, but one that still raises ethical questions today. Was Ethel truly guilty of espionage, or was she punished for refusing to betray her husband, and for remaining silent in a moment that demanded confession? As Julius and Ethel Rosenberg awaited their fate behind bars, their case exploded into a global controversy. Across Europe, Latin America, and even parts of Asia, people rallied in protest. To many, this wasn't just a legal matter, it was a political one, a sign that the United States was using its justice system to punish ideology, not just crime. Intellectuals, artists, and activists formed committees, organized demonstrations, and wrote passionate letters demanding mercy. Albert Einstein, a man deeply committed to peace and justice, called for clemency. So did Pablo Picasso, Bertolt Brecht, Frida Kahlo, and Jean-Paul Sartre. In France and the UK, mass rallies drew thousands, and editorial editorials condemned what they saw as a miscarriage of justice fueled by anti-communist hysteria. Inside the United States, the reaction was more divided. Some Americans believed the Rosenbergs were dangerous, that the rise of the Soviet nuclear program was a direct result of stolen secrets. Others were disturbed by the severity of the sentence, especially in Ethel's case. After all, she was a mother of two, with no hard evidence tying her to the core of the operation. The U.S. government remained unmoved. President Dwight D. Eisenhower rejected a final plea for clemency, citing the seriousness of their actions in the nuclear age. He argued that leniency would send the wrong message during a time when global tensions were high and national loyalty was considered absolute. But around the world, the executions were viewed as a harsh symbol of Cold War paranoia, and to this day, they're seen by many as a political warning cloaked in legal language. June 19th, 1953. The Rosenbergs had exhausted every legal appeal. The Supreme Court had rejected multiple petitions. President Eisenhower had refused to intervene. That evening, they were led separately to the execution chamber at Sing Sing Prison in Ossining, New York. Julius went first. He remained composed, walking calmly to the electric chair. A black hood was placed over his head, and the first current surged through his body. Witnesses reported a faint smell in the air, a grim reminder of the method. It took 2 jolts to bring an end to his life. Ethel followed just minutes later. She had kissed her children goodbye days earlier and maintained her innocence to the very end. But her execution did not go as expected. The first shock failed to stop her heart, then another, and another. It reportedly took 5 separate jolts before doctors declared her gone. Witnesses in the room were visibly shaken. The process had been drawn out, and to some, unnecessarily cruel. Outside the prison, crowds had gathered. Some protested, chanting prayers and demanding clemency. Others came to support the sentence, holding signs that read, "Justice served." Inside, it was the quiet that told the real story, the end of 2 lives whose guilt, innocence, and legacy remain debated to this day. Their 2 sons, Michael and Robert, were just 10 and 6 at the time. That night, they became orphans. They would spend the rest of their lives seeking answers and trying to separate fact from fear in the story that defined their family. For decades, the Rosenberg case remained a flashpoint of controversy. Supporters argued they were victims of Cold War hysteria, while critics believed the executions were justified. But in the 1990s, a seismic shift occurred. The U.S. government declassified a top-secret intelligence project known as Venona, a long-running program in which American cryptanalysts had intercepted and decrypted thousands of Soviet communications during and after World War II. Among these files was a name, Liberal, a code name tied to Julius Rosenberg. The Venona documents confirmed that Julius had been in direct contact with Soviet intelligence and had passed information to them. It was the strongest evidence yet that Julius had, in fact, been a Soviet spy. But when it came to Ethel, the trail was murkier. Her name appeared in some cables, usually in reference to Julius. There was no direct evidence that she had passed secrets or played an active role in the spy network. She was mentioned, yes, but not implicated with the same clarity or certainty. What the Venona cables revealed most clearly was this: the Cold War had not only bred fear, it had bred secrecy. And even decades later, with files declassified and truths emerging, the full extent of what the Rosenbergs did and didn't do remained painfully elusive. The Rosenberg case didn't unfold in a vacuum. It played out at the height of America's Cold War anxiety. When the fear of communism was so strong, it seeped into schools, workplaces, and even family homes. Just months before the trial began, the Korean War had erupted. Senator Joseph McCarthy was rising to prominence, publicly accusing government officials of communist sympathies. And in the minds of many Americans, the idea that Soviet spies had stolen the atomic bomb wasn't just alarming, it was unforgivable. The Rosenbergs, a young Jewish couple with communist ties, were the perfect scapegoats. Their case became a symbol, not just of espionage, but of everything the country feared: infiltration, betrayal, and nuclear vulnerability. The government needed a message, and the Rosenbergs became that message. Their refusal to confess or cooperate only amplified their supposed guilt in the public eye. But the trial also revealed deep flaws in the justice system under pressure. The evidence against Julius was strong, but the case against Ethel was tenuous at best. Still, both received the same sentence. Why? Because their silence, their unwillingness to name names or show remorse, was interpreted as defiance. And in a time of national panic, defiance was treated like treason, Across the world, protests erupted. Appeals for clemency came from artists, scientists, and political leaders. Yet, in the US, the verdict held. The Rosenbergs were no longer people. They were a warning, a grim lesson of what could happen if you stood on the wrong side of the ideological line. Their trial didn't just define an era. It revealed how justice can become secondary to fear, and how fear, once inflamed, can lead to irreversible consequences. Today, the story of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg is still debated, not just by historians, but by generations trying to understand how fear, politics, and family could collide with such devastating force. Julius was involved in espionage, that much is clear, but how much he truly gave the Soviets and how essential it was to their nuclear program remains contested. As for Ethel, her role is still shrouded in doubt, her conviction resting largely on the word of her brother. What's left is a legacy defined not by certainty, but by what-ifs. What if the government had offered a fairer trial? What if the climate hadn't been so poisoned by paranoia? What if the Rosenbergs had spoken? Or someone had intervened? Instead, their lives ended in the electric chair, not just as alleged spies, but as symbols of a nation's deepest fears. Their sons, Michael and Robert, grew up carrying that weight. They changed their names, rebuilt their lives, and for decades, they sought justice for a mother they believed was wrongfully condemned. They weren't just fighting for truth, they were fighting for the right to be seen as more than the children of traitors. In the end, the Rosenberg story isn't just about espionage. It's about trust, loyalty, and how quickly the machinery of justice can turn into something far more ruthless. They remain to this day a cautionary tale, not only of the dangers of betrayal, but of what happens when fear outweighs facts and when justice becomes a spectacle.